Our first lesson is going to be chapter 14 in your book, In Pursuit of Democracy. Now, since most of the first chapter begins, or the chapter, not the first chapter, but the chapter we'll be doing, concerns the teens of the early 20th century, and that's when President Wilson was president, I thought we'd spend a little time learning about him as well as what was going on in the United States. Because you can't just study one segment of something, you have to, there's too many other things that are involved. Now, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, born the son of a Presbyterian minister in Virginia in 1856. And he looks like he's been sucking on a lemon, doesn't it? He was the most educated man to ever hold the office, even up until now. He had a dozen college degrees and had written many scholarly books before he ever became president. And among his degrees was one that I love, a history degree. He had a political science degree, and he had a law degree. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins, and he taught at several universities, and as a matter of fact, he was even the president of Princeton University for a while. Now, the only elected office he ever held was that of governor of New Jersey, and he had run on the platform that he'd had no political experience, and I guess this was to show that he wasn't a corrupt politician. But he was elected, and during his tenure of governor, he pushed through many reform measures. Now, like Lincoln, he won the presidential election, but he did not win the popular vote. If it hadn't been for, shall we say, a disagreement between the sitting president and the former president, he would never have been elected. It took 46 roll calls at the Democratic Convention before he even became a leader. So Wilson is president in 1912. He's president in appearance. He's very cool. He's very austere. He has no personal magnetism at all. And his style of presidency is called missionary. He's a very, very religious man. So now it's 1912, and we have a new president, a Democrat. So let's take a quick look at what's going on in our country at the turn of the century. During the early 1890s, there was a movement afoot to change our society, to eliminate the evils of the industrialization. And in many cases, most of these movements were led by middle and upper class women. They wanted to correct the evils such as prostitution and prohibition, because they had an idea if they could, outlaw liquor, then the man gets his paycheck and comes home from work and gives his wife the paycheck and she pays the bills and buys groceries. Whereas at the time, the men were stopping on their way home from work and having a few drinks and something at the local bar or gambling, and they get home, they'd be broke, and when the wife would ask for money to buy milk for the children or to pay the rent, he'd hit his wife and kick the dog. Very defensive. So if you could get rid of prostitution, get rid of prohibition, maybe have some direct elections or just, popular vote. We need more democracy. And of course, we want to improve the working conditions for all men and women. It depended on where you lived, what you worked for. There was also a move to improve race relations. And of course, the problem is that it's difficult to admit there was a race problem. During this time, the NACW, which you probably never heard of, the National Association of Colored Women, was formed. It was formed before the NAACP was formed, as a matter of fact, in 1909. It was formed in New York City by a group of black and white citizens fighting for control. And of the names listed there, Mary White Overton is a very rich socialite white woman. And she's the one that got the whole ball rolling. And most of the others are white and black together. Oh my goodness, we're having a storm, folks. And because they wanted to have a big name, and W.E.B. Du Bois was very well known at that time and very, very well educated, had his PhD and the whole bit. They were going to form a magazine through the NAACP called The Crisis, which incidentally is still around. And he took it and he went with it, and it became the premier crusading voice for civil rights for African Americans. The reformers tried to make changes at the local level, of course. But when it failed, the county people won't do anything. You go to the state level. And if that fails, you go all the way to the national level. So the reformers had moved from social reform to social control, which, social reform would be educating you on how to make your life better. Social control was telling you you've got to make your life better, you're going to jail. So some would say it was basically nothing more than an attempt to legislate morality. Now, Teddy Roosevelt became president when President William McKinley was assassinated, and he's known as the first progressive or reform president. Successor was William Howard Taft, and yes, he's the big fat one they had to have a special bathtub for. And they were Republicans. And Roosevelt, McKinley, and Wilson are called the first three reform presidents. But Teddy served 2 terms, and his handpicked successor was William Howard Taft. The man had never really held an elected office before either. All he wanted to do was be a judge. He didn't want to be president, but his wife wanted to be the first lady, and Teddy liked him, and he thought he'd make a good follower-up on what he was doing. But then Teddy learns that Mr. Taft is bowing down to the money men and going against the policies he'd set up, even though they're both Republicans. So he comes back and he tries to talk the Republican Party into nominating him to run for president again. And they said, no, we've got a sitting president. Taft's going to be our choice. So Teddy forms his own party called the Bull Moose Party. And what does that do? Well, it does nothing but draw votes from Taft. And when you split a party, all you're doing is opening the door for another party to win. And that's what happened. By the Bull Moose were basically Republican as well as Republican Party, but you couldn't count all the votes together. So Wilson became the president. It took something like 40 some odd votes for him to ever be nominated. The black community's torn. Some voted for Teddy. There's a president they knew and a Republican. Some voted for Taft because he was Republican. And some even voted for Wilson, who was a Democrat. Now, that took some doing because they had a strong inborn dislike and fear of the Democratic Party. But Wilson, he was from the North. Maybe he'd be okay. Progressivism is in full swing in the United States. There's a fight going on between a former president and a current president, and Europe is on fire. And the black community is not watching any of it because their lives have not been made better. Europe, World War I, the war to end all wars, the big one as it's called. And your major countries, of course, are England and France and Russia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and they're all tied up in a series of alliances. The Archduke Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Austria-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in a little country called Sarajevo, which is just across the Adriatic Sea from Italy, a very small country. And it sets in motion not only the World War, but something we're going to come to learn about: trench warfare, chemical warfare, Irish rebellion, a Russian revolution, and millions of people dead. Children, women, men. Europe was guilty of militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and those crazy alliance system. It seemed like, for instance, Germany started wanting to build up a little bit before 1900. She wanted to improve her navy. And England has always been the queen of the seas. And as soon as she saw that Germany was building up her navy, she had to come up with money to increase her navy. When Germany tried to improve their military and rearm them, France looked on and said, oh, I got to do that too. So every time you turn around, whatever one country was doing, you've got to counteract it so you won't lose the balance of power. And before you know it, everybody is militaristic. They're very, very nationalistic. You've got those crazy alliances, and everybody wants a piece of the pie, which happens to be at this point in time either Africa or India. So she's a tinderbox, just waiting for the match. And the assassination was the match. Oh, of course, it came as a complete surprise to us, and well, it shouldn't have been because Wilson had sent some people over to do some investigating, but we didn't think it would. If it did happen, it should have stayed local. It should never have gone viral. A short war. So we declared neutrality. And looked at the situation on paper. It should have been a short war. But President Wilson used the excuse of our ethnic diversity in the United States to keep us out of it. And it had some validity. I mean, after all, our nation we came from different countries. And the people who were over here who were Irish, of course, would support the Germans because they hated the English. The people who were English derivative would support the English. And what about all those Germans? Oh, man. There's a lot of Germans in Kentucky, too. So this was the excuse he used, that if we picked the wrong side, the rest of the country would have another civil war. Well, we tried to stay neutral and just provided loans for these countries. But the U-boats, the Untersee Boot, began blockading not only England but France and sinking ships. Well, Wilson, through diplomatic channels, talked to the Kaiser and talked him into not sinking any more unarmed ships. If he did, we were going to break diplomatic relations. So Wilson's happy. The U.S. citizens are happy because our president made the Kaiser back down. And Wilson says, well, we're not going to send any men overseas. And he wins a second term as president on the promise of peace and keeping our boys at home. Let's back up just a little bit. Wilson's first term. Unfortunately, and I'm very ashamed of the man for this, but when you stop and consider his background, he's from Virginia, he is a true dyed-in-the-wool Southerner, and he is a white supremacist. There's a flood of legislation going to Congress, and some of it he's proposed, to segregate the blacks from the whites in the District of Columbia. Most of them did fail, but he did manage to get through the African American Federal Employees Act, which segregated them from the cafeterias and restrooms so they could no longer eat with the whites or use the same bathroom. And there were plans underway to try to eliminate them from any form of government service. Then all of a sudden, he shows this racist film, The Birth of a Nation, which, if you're not familiar with the film, is not only racist, it glorifies the Ku Klux Klan. They're the angels who are going to save all the white people of the South against all the evil black Republicans. And he's been quoted as saying, it is like writing history with lightning. And my only regret is that it is also terribly true. It just makes you sick at your stomach. Meanwhile, there's all kinds of things going on. There's a riot in Waco, Texas in 1916 where they burned a black man publicly. Over 3,000 people attended. In South Carolina, a black farmer got killed for impudence. He refused to take the amount of money that a white man offered him for his land. And in Mexico, 22 black soldiers were killed. What's going on? Bad, bad, bad. Now, Booker T. Washington dies late in 1915, and all of a sudden, we have no more black leader to preach moderation and patience. Who's going to help us? There's no one to pull the black communities together. Meanwhile, a group of distinguished, educated African Americans came together to discuss the state of affairs, and they agreed to work for total enfranchisement and try to get a law passed to outlaw lynching and to enforce the civil rights. And they agreed to seek democracy that had been denied to them and that was being offered to the rest of the war. And back to 1917. April, war. And we're totally unprepared. We have a very small army, only 750,000, and not most of them, but there's an awful lot of that is top-heavy and older officers. 20,000 of them are black, and most of those are stationed out in the West. They're still fighting Indians. And the African Americans are volunteering by the thousands. It seemed like as soon as the call went out, they rushed to volunteer. And of course, they weren't accepted at first, but then all of a sudden, that Selective Service Act was passed calling on all able-bodied Americans. And more than 2 million registered, and of those, over 300,000 were actually called to service. As a matter of fact, the percentage of blacks volunteering was higher than the white volunteers. And for those who did not volunteer, there was no draft dodging in the black army. But blacks decided, well, you know, we need to be led by black officers, because in the past there'd been black units in every war, but they'd always been led by a white man. And they were complaining about, we need to have black officers, and the whites said, well, you know, it's not a good idea. Then some colleges began protesting. They said, we'll help train some officers. So finally the government stated that if you can find me 200 black college men of good moral character, we'll train them. And within 10 days, they had over 1,500. And the response was, where did they come from? Okay, we got them. Now what are we going to do? We're going to train them. So they set up a separate training camp, and the blacks are protesting. Now, why would they protest? Well, think about it for a minute. And that's segregation. And this is one of the things the blacks are protesting is we don't want to be segregated. We want to be integrated. But the thing I hate the worst is those training camps they set up in the South. Now, this is done for a reason, too. I know you're close to transportation. You've got the rivers and you've got the oceans, and it's warmer, so you don't have to worry about cold winters. But that's not a good idea. In October of 1917, 329 black men were actually commissioned. But blacks wearing uniforms in the United States, blacks carrying guns, all this propaganda coming out of Germany. And we got lynching all over the country, especially in the South. So the government does something I consider incredibly sensitive. They asked Dr. Emmett J. Scott to be a special assistant to the Secretary of War to advise them on African Americans, how to get along, how to take care of things, anything that's going to affect the black soldiers. We need your help. Now, this is Dr. Emmett J. Scott. Very serious looking man, isn't he? He's got his little glasses on like Teddy Roosevelt used to wear, and he had certain duties. He was going to promote morale among the black troops. He was going to answer any questions the black man had and investigate any unfair treatment that was reported. And he's going to work with the Community on Public Information, the CPI, which was nothing more than a propaganda organization. Now, complaints, well, I'm not going to say some of the derogatory names they were called. You can only imagine them. But they were called very derogatory names. They were forced to work in unhealthy and dangerous conditions. They were denied service in the public restaurants. They were taunted. And sure enough, there was a riot in Houston in August of 1917, and 17 whites were killed. Oh my gosh, Katie, by the door, a white man killed by a black man in the South. Oh, but we're democracy. Oh yeah, we're democracy. So we had a trial, and 13 soldiers were convicted and hanged. 41 were sent to prison, and 40 were held indefinitely with no charges. Not good. There was even discrimination at the YMCA. Sometimes they would set tables outside so the volunteers could make them help them right. They wouldn't let them come in the building because they're black. Now, the South objects to black men from the North being sent south to train. And they object to a black man being in uniform altogether, but that's their biggest objection. A black man from the North coming down south. And they finally did agree that they were going to train the African-American troops in an area that they're from. Don't send a Chicago African-American to Atlanta, Georgia to train. That's not going to work. But South Carolina has a plan. And they're going to use the same plan that they used during the Revolutionary War, where they used to what they call harass the soldiers, taunt them, torment them, push them, throw snowballs at them with rocks in them, spit on them. Do anything you could to get them to strike you. And this is what they were going to do. They were going to insult the black man. They're going to cause problems, get the black man to react. And if he hits me first, then I could say, I told you so. I'll tell you a little story. I think it's Spartanburg, South Carolina. The 15th New York Infantry, which had been converted from the militia, people of Spartanburg said, oh, they're jaunty and haughty. They don't even know their place, for goodness sakes. When the drum major, because they had a band, he went into town and went to a hotel to buy a newspaper. As he came to the door, the proprietor cussed at him and demanded he remove his hat. And he didn't even wait for the guy to do it. He just knocked off the man's hat onto the floor. And when the young man bent over to pick it up, he kicked him in the derriere. Well, he left. But when his buddies back at the base found out what happened, they wanted to rush Spartanburg and take care of it. Well, the master of the band found out what was happening and called his men to attention and ordered them to disperse, which they did. But it didn't end there. There was a lot of anger. And even though their bandmaster was James Reese Europe, one of the most famous of the time, they get together and they make plans. We're going to go into town tomorrow night and we're going to shoot that town up. Well, their commanding officer found out about it. He did manage to get them to stay by restricting them to base. And all of a sudden, Emmett Scott rushed to South Carolina to investigate. Wanted to defuse that situation. And he pleaded with the man to not do anything that would bring dishonor on the regiment or their race. Meanwhile, the War Department has come up with 3 possible choices. One, you can keep the regiment there in Spartanburg and face a possible eruption. You can move the regiment to another location, which is exactly what Spartanburg wants you to do. or you can send the regiment overseas, not trained. Now, I'm going to stop there for just a minute. And this past Sunday, there was something in the paper about the sheriff of Spartanburg back in 1918. He'd been the sheriff for a number of years, so he was sheriff during this time. It was talking about how a black man had been accused of rape, and he was in a jail, and the citizens of Spartanburg were going to break him out and hang him, and they'd done it in several other South Carolina towns. And he stood his ground, and he wouldn't let the white man have the black man. He even had to shoot a white man to keep him from coming to take the black man away. And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, if he is that conscientious about the law in Spartanburg, why didn't he do something at this point in time? And I'm in the process of doing some investigating to find out what's going on. How can you be one way one year and the other way the other? It doesn't make any sense to me. I think one of these two stories doesn't add up. That's a bad thing about being a historian. Well, surprise, the government in their infinite wisdom, they changed the name from the 15th New York to the 369th Infantry, and they sent them to France. The first African-American combat troops to arrive. And they weren't trained. The first few months they were there, they didn't have a lot to do. There is a YouTube at the end called Harlem Hellfighters, which I tried to put into the PowerPoint, and it works for regular PowerPoint, but it doesn't work when I'm trying to record it. So as much as I would like to have it right here for you to see after you listen to the lecture, watch it. It's not bad. Got some real good actual film footage. So the French trained them because the Americans didn't want them working with the white boys, so they transferred them to the French army, and the French was perfectly delighted to have them. They treated these men like equals. They taught them to use hand grenades and bayonets and guns, and I think this is a picture of them showing how to do hand grenades. But the 369th saw nonstop action all the way to the end of the war, and they were very proud of the fact they never lost a man through capture. They never gave up a foot of ground or lost a trench. They're called the Hellfighters by Germans, but of course they were called the Harlem Hellfighters by us. And the entire regiment won the Croix de Guerre, which is the French Medal of Honor. Well, when the Germans learned that the all-black 92nd Division was arriving, they began a really massive propaganda campaign. And, of course, sending, dropping leaflets behind the lines. And, well, they didn't use radio that much then. That's World War II when they used the radio. They were trying to demoralize them. And one of the things they said, well, what is democracy? Personal freedom and all citizens enjoying the same rights socially and before the war? Do you enjoy those rights that the white people do in America? The land of freedom and democracy? Or are you rather not treated over there as second-class citizens? Can you go into a restaurant where white people eat? Dare you get a seat in a theater where white people sit? Is lynching and the most horrible crimes connected there with lawful proceedings in a democratic country? Come over to our side. We'll treat you like a gentleman. Don't fight for those Wall Street robbers just to protect money loaned to the British and the French and the Italians. Come on over to Germany's side. Not one did. Of course, anytime they heard of anything going on, in the United States, like a lynching or something like that, they would immediately print it up and distribute it. Now, one of the methods for keeping up the morale for the African Americans was music. And most combat units did have their own bands, and of course every black one did. And these men are the men who introduced France to jazz and caused France to become a magnet for the blacks after the war. But the French were just absolutely amazed to see soldiers playing, marching to this fast music, and man, they would just really do it up proud. Now, Lieutenant James Grease Europe. He was already a very well-established musician of jazz by the time World War I made him very famous. He's the one that really spiced him up. When the United States entered World War I, Cicely, they were like hand in glove. Cicely was a songwriter, and Europe was a band director. And they both enlisted in the Army together and organized a regimental band. And they accompanied the 369th, the first unit to arrive in France. And the brave black unit, including the band, earned the nickname Hellfighters because of all the campaigns they were in. By the end of the war, the infantry jazz band ranked among the greatest bands in the world. If you ever get a chance to go online, I found a couple of the old recordings, but it didn't show them in military uniform. It showed them in civilian uniform. But it was jazz, and of course we get to the jazz age shortly. Ooh, I love jazz. But But out of this 7,800 Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA workers sent overseas, only 87 were black. And I think, as a matter of fact, in your book, Passing for Black, May Street Kid was one of the 87. The black nurses didn't get over there until after the war. And of the 367,000 black soldiers there, they only had 20 black chaplains. They really weren't taking care of their boys. And some black soldiers even attended French schools, which were good. And they were being treated just like a normal person. They were invited to the French people's homes. The French ladies would go out with them. And words got back here that the black and the white French are mixing. And oh, they are outraged. Some whites from here took it upon themselves to circulate a document called Secret Information Concerning Black Troops. And in it, they accused the black troops of being racist. And that's why we're compelled to lynch and burn here in order to keep them in their place. He said it would be very unfortunate if the French officers were to associate with black officers or have any contact with them. Well, fortunately, the French officers and the French civilians and soldiers did not take the message seriously. They thought it was funny. It kind of goes along hand in glove when the War Department asked the French people to close all the brothels when our American soldiers got there because they didn't want our American boys being exposed to the French prostitutes. They laughed at us every now and then. Like I said, but fortunately, the French just kind of took it with a grain of salt and went on. And they got along famously. But reports that black soldiers were attacking French women were received and assaulting them in large numbers. And it was feared that the black man, bad in his own right, was picking up even further bad habits from the French. So it got so bad that the government, here again, sent a very well-respected black man, Dr. Robert R. Morton, which happened to be Booker T. Washington's successor, Tuskegee, to go to France and to investigate. And while initial reports from the white commanders was not good, when he looked at it closer, out of 1,200 men in one regiment, the 92nd, only 7 cases had been reported. And of those 7, only 2 had been found guilty. So according to General Pershing at the time, the problem did not lay with the black troops. It could have happened to any division, white or black. As a matter of fact, it was probably less percentage than it was with the white troops. But then Dr. Morton got the troops together and he reminded them not to expect the same freedoms and good treatment from white Americans when they get back home as they're getting from the white French. But even with the warning, there were fears and hopes among the black men. And no matter what had been said, the men were not ready for what was waiting for them when they got home. Now, this is a very, very, very brief historical summary of the war. Of course, when the war started, we were unprepared, but we get ready, and while we're getting ready to go to war, Russia has a revolution, and the Bolsheviks, or the communists, take over. And this new government, the Bolsheviks, made peace with Germany because they were really out of the war within 6 months after it started. So all those German troops that had been on the Russian front were sent to the Western Front, which happened to be France. And they had a big offensive and got within 50 miles of Paris, and they bogged down. This is where the infamous trench fighting begins. The trenches were god-awful. I had some pictures I was going to put in here, and I decided that you can't believe the conditions. It would be 3 trenches, the front line, the supply line, and the relief line in the back. And they would be full of water and rats and dead bodies, and whenever the gas was shot off, it would just hang in there. It would be wet and muddy, and sometimes you would go days and even weeks and not be able to stick your head out. And in front of the front lines of the trenches, it'd be barbed wire to keep anybody from coming in on you, but every now and then, some insane officer would yell, "Over the top." You go over the top, and the Germans, whose lines were just a few hundred yards away, had the same thing, trenches, and as soon as you stuck your head out, they'd shoot it. Of course, we did the same thing. As soon as they stuck their heads out, we'd shoot them. So you're bogged down. It's a stalemate. The only problem is the German trenches were so much better made. They were prepared to stay, whereas the French and the English, they were just temporary things. The Germans had cement floors. They had running water and electricity. They were much better prepared. But anyway, this offensive gets within 50 miles of Paris and bogs down. And all of a sudden, the Americans arrived. 1.2 million, young, well-equipped, enthusiastic, ready to fight, with never a thought in the world of not winning. And they tipped the balance. You know, over there. The Yanks are coming. Anyway, I won't do that to you. So the war is over. And they signed something called the Treaty of Versailles. I think they just like that castle. Is why they always sign treaties over there. Beautiful castle. President Wilson, well, he decides he's going to lead the group over there. And this is unheard of because the president just doesn't go to a peace conference. Of course, he'd been making plans since long before the war ended, and he was very enthusiastic about the outcome, and he had this plan to form something called the League of Nations. But his own party in Congress didn't go along with it. And the idea he had in this League of Nations was to, well, we were going to have one of the segments in there said they were going to have mutual defense. They didn't like that. Mutual defense to them, to us in the state, meant that, well, for instance, if we had another civil war, then Russia or Great Britain or somebody could send troops over to help one side or the other. That's interfering in our business, and we don't want any part of it. So it frightened us. And the only consideration for the blacks at all was a redistribution of the African colonies. Meanwhile, W.E.B. Du Bois calls for a Pan-American conference to meet in Paris. I apologize. I have a little puppy. And at this conference, there were 57 blacks totaling. There were 16 African Americans, 20 from West India, and 12 actually from Africa. The result, like I said, is very limited, but it did call attention to the fact that the blacks are interested in this treaty. They want to know what's going on. It's being debated. Let me get us in there, too. So what was the home front like during the war? Well, during the war, we purchased more than $250 million in government bonds. And that's just from the black community. The white community came up with more than that, too. They had these dime drives. I mean, I can remember as a kid in school when there was a war, they'd bring this little packet around. They used to also do it for the March of Dimes. And you'd put your nickels and dimes in there and you'd get a war bond. And you could buy, $15, buy a $25 war bond. And in 10 years, you'd have $25. You're helping the government and you're also saving for yourself. All kinds of drives. This war, when we started out with this war, we were a borrowing nation. With the end of the war, the war was paid for between the increase in taxes because you've got more people working for the first time and all the bonds that were purchased, we paid for the war and had money left. And with the white men leaving their jobs to go into the military, all of a sudden you've got a shortage of people. What are you going to do? Where can you, oh, I know, we'll go down south and get them. So the white recruiters went down to the south and recruited the blacks, come on up here, get a job. And it's been estimated that as many as 1 million left, although the actual census doesn't say that many. And after all, with the lynching going on and discrimination down there and no jobs, of course they're ready to go to the north. But the migration was so great that the southern white men got alarmed because they're losing their laborers. They had houses without servants and farms without laborers and churches. Black churches were even going empty. It got so bad that the southern states actually passed ordinances requiring the agents who were recruiting to have a license. Now, think just a minute. If you were here in Davis County and you moved to New York or Chicago, you think you're going to find things the same? Not bloody likely. They got different rules. They've got different ordinances. They've got different foods. They wear different types of clothing. They even talk differently. And different pricing. And that's if you're white and you're educated. Think what it would be like if you were black and didn't even have a high school education or you're from the South. These poor people coming up there had no clue what they were getting into. Now, an organization called the National Urban League did try to help the new arrivals. They tried to help them find jobs, and they had branches in Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, a lot of the industrial cities. But the African Americans were very suspicious of labor unions, and they tried to organize their own. And the AFL stated that all workers, regardless of their race, should unite, etc., etc., etc. But the black worker didn't buy it. Employment they did find. They worked in the steel mills, on the shipping yards, in the coal mines, on the railroads, vital communications area, and the women, of course, were allowed to go to work in the domestic services. So it sounds like we got good race relations, right? Nope. Volunteer state, Tennessee. More than 3,000 Americans answered the call to come and witness the burning of a live Negro. In East St. Louis, 40 blacks lost their lives in a riot that began over the employment of blacks in a factory with a government contract. And in one incident, a 2-year-old was shot and then thrown into a burning building. And of course, the Germans kept all this information very carefully and used it in their propaganda. At last, after this incident with the child, President Wilson finally issued a very strong statement against violent lynching. Now, like, that's going to stop it. The black newspapers, the black press, had supported the war. And they'd even sent a war correspondent, what was his name? I think it was Ralph Taylor, to the front lines. So the heroism and the bravery of the black soldiers were all reported, along with the discrimination and everything else bad that happened. W.E.B. Du Bois urged blacks to forget the grievances we had with the white man, close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our white citizens, and fight for democracy. Okay, the war's over. Everyone's jubilant. When the blacks came back through, they were treated with respect in New York. They were allowed to march in the parade down Fifth Avenue. But in the small southern my tongue got twisted. In these small southern white towns, the reaction was totally different. They were met with violence. And there were many cases of the black man coming back into town without his gun. He just had his uniform on. And they would either whip him or actually hang him. Jubilation. The war's over. But it becomes fearful because we're starting to see vicious attacks on the returning blacks. We had this Russian Revolution, and the Bolsheviks took over, and they're calling for an overthrow of capitalism. We have something called the Red Scare. We got strikes. And all of a sudden, anything that was not considered normal and 150% American was branded as communistic. And of course, that included any demand for equal rights from the returning soldiers. So the combination of the Red Scare, which is going to be a scare connected with communism, and the Red Summer, which is the violence against the blacks, it's going to bring a lot more heartache to our black population. Now I got a rhetorical question for you. Why was the black man so willing to fight and die for a country that treated him like a third-class citizen and even denied him the rights of citizenship? The think question. You don't have to answer, but think about it. Now, our next lesson is Chapter 15, Voices of Protest, and we will learn about the Red Scare and the Red Summer. Now, I did not follow the chapter exactly, but did give you the information just in a little bit different way, and I hope it didn't confuse you. Okay. I want to thank you for listening, and good luck on your quiz and your graded questions.